the world's #1 name in suspense, on the page and screen.
I'm actually a huge Stephen King fan.
A lot of the great Stephen King things, that's the stuff that really scares me.
Every turn of the page, I was just dumbfounded.
Yet for many of his 60-plus years, the worst demons King struggled with were his own.
He thought that if he stopped drinking and doing drugs, that he would stop writing.
His family staged an intervention. Either you get straight or you leave.
But through his addiction and 2 brushes with death,
he was severely injured, I think probably more seriously than the press was aware of.
King's focus never wavered.
He works really hard to live a very normal life. His weirdness is inside.
For nearly 35 years, Stephen King has been writing some of the world's best-selling fiction.
People will say, where do you get your ideas? I don't know where I get them. You know, and if I did, man, would I tell you?
His stories have been translated into 37 different languages, filling more than 70 novels and novellas, 110 short stories, and over 50 film and TV adaptations, with more projects on the way.
The Ghost Brothers of Darkland County is a project where he teamed up with John Mellencamp.
So the idea is that it would be a Broadway show, with Mellencamp writing the music and Steve writing the story.
Like a bottomless well, Stephen continues creating unforgettable tales of the supernatural, including his short stories, which have inspired films like 1408.
This film is about a very evil hotel room.
And The Mist.
That envelops a town in New England and weird bad things happen.
And Secret Window.
This one just had me, it just took me. I was completely in shock.
A lot of people know Stephen King primarily through the movies.
Countless nightmares have been inspired by his best-known works, Misery, The Shining, and Carrie. But he's also written critically acclaimed non-horror, like The Green Mile, The Shawshank Redemption, Stand By Me, and Dolores Claiborne.
He doesn't write straight horror as much as he used to, and so he's lost fans along the way, but he keeps getting new fans.
Well, he could have retired a long time ago if it was just about the money.
You want to know what I'm really afraid of in terms of my work is that I won't know when it's time to stop.
Stephen King's story begins in Maine, a state known for its incredible beauty, harsh winters, and practical, no-nonsense residents. During World War II, Stephen's father, Donald Edwin King, served in the Merchant Marines, traveling the world. Afterward, he returned to Maine and sold vacuum cleaners door to door. Donald and his wife, Ruth Pillsbury King, adopted their first son, David, after doctors told them Ruth could never bear children. But in 1947, to her surprise, she became pregnant. On September 21st, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy, Stephen Edwin King. The Kings welcomed their miracle baby. Ruth stayed home and tended her young boys, while Donald was the breadwinner. Until 1950, when Donald changed their lives forever.
He said, Ruth, I'm going to go out and get a pack of cigarettes. And that was the last she ever saw of him.
For the next 9 years, Ruth and her boys moved from the East Coast to the Midwest and back again, chasing whatever work Ruth could get. Sometimes they stayed with Ruth's family, sometimes with Donald's, always hoping he might return.
It was such a big stigma to not have a father in the 50s. And so Ruth would tell the kids to say, just tell me he's in the Navy.
She was a worker. And that has certainly influenced the both of us. I don't think anyone could ever say Steve and I are lazy. The other thing I think that came from our mom was persistence.
There were times when Ruth couldn't afford a babysitter and had to leave her small boys alone while she worked.
I understood that David used to read to Stephen and then get Stephen to read to him, and that's how they took care of each other. And she'd come home and ask him questions to make sure that they had focused on reading while she was gone. But at that time, they would have been like 4, 5, 6, very young.
He spent most of what should have been his first year in school essentially in bed. He had some ear infections which spread into his tonsils, and he started to write. And so the fact that he has a vivid imagination, I think, made that year more tolerable, and perhaps was a very seminal point for him in developing the imagination and the ability to tell stories.
While Ruth encouraged her sons to read, she was disturbed by what Stephen gravitated toward: mystery stories and early horror comic books. Inevitably, they gave him nightmares.
When he was a child, and he first started out by adapting comic books into short stories, she told him he could do better than that he should be writing his own stories rather than putting together what other people had written.
And when he wrote a better story, she would pay him a quarter.
In 1958, Ruth moved her boys to Durham, Maine. There she would care for her ailing parents full-time. In return, her sister gave them a house to live in. Ruth was paid in goods, groceries, and clothing, and occasionally worked part-time to make extra money. Even by Durham standards, the Kings were exceptionally poor. Their house had no indoor plumbing, and in the cold Maine winters, Stephen and his brother walked to their aunt's house for a hot bath.
He and his brother David knew how impoverished they were, how hard his mother worked, but yet he could do nothing to help her.
Ruth dealt with their circumstances with a sense of humor and the instincts of a storyteller.
She worked at Pineland, which was for the mentally handicapped. To make the job livable, you had to have a little bit of humor about some things that maybe aren't really particularly humorous.
In 1959, 13-year-old David found an old mimeograph machine and wrote a local newsletter called Dave's Rag. It sold for a nickel. Stephen contributed reviews of TV shows and short stories. The boys may have been the poorest in town, but they were hard to ignore.
Dave was so ambitious in doing everything. Steve was the reader. He was kind of a big, goofy kid. He'd be walking down the road, and he'd always be reading his book.
At age 11, Stephen was over 6 feet tall, awkward, uncoordinated, and severely myopic. But his friends at Durham Elementary admired his quick wit and intelligence.
Our family were readers, all three of us. When we were living in Durham, I can remember especially, if you came in at supper time, you'd see the three of us seated around the table, each of us reading our own paperback.
Stephen's world revolved around those books. At home, he lined the walls of his room with paperbacks. And if he made money doing jobs for neighbors, he'd head to nearby Lewiston, Maine, to indulge in sci-fi and horror movies.
He thrived on horror magazines and horror movies. Every movie that we ever went to was usually a horror movie. He loved to be scared.
When he couldn't afford movies, Stephen would visit friends and stay up late watching horror movies or The Twilight Zone on TV. He said that the monsters, ghouls, and vampires that made his friends scream never scared him. Stephen, in fact, had many fears: spiders, closed-in spaces, sewers, funerals, the number 13, the dark. But more than anything, Stephen feared the very thin line between good and evil. At 11, he began collecting stories about real-life mass murderer Charlie Starkweather, who'd gone on a killing spree with his girlfriend in Nebraska and Wyoming. Stephen's mother found this collection and told him he was warped, but it was the beginning of a lifelong pattern.
He always felt that by dealing with his fear, through writing them down, it would help make it disappear.
In 1960, Stephen discovered that his love of writing may have been no accident. He stumbled upon a box in his aunt's attic. Much to his surprise, he discovered his long-gone father was an aspiring writer with a stack of rejection slips from magazines.
And the letters suggested that he had a lot of talent and asked him to resubmit other stories. And I asked my mother about that one time because she kept all his stuff, and she just kind of laughed and said, "Stephen, your father didn't have any persistence. That's why he left the marriage."
Stephen began submitting his own stories to magazines and started his own collection of rejection slips. But unlike his father, Stephen didn't stop. He was determined to get published.
He started submitting when he was as young as 13 years old.
In the fall of 1963, Stephen began attending Lisbon High School. He gained notoriety and a 3-day suspension for publishing a parody of the high school newspaper called The Village Vomit. He also taught himself the guitar and formed a band. But unlike most teenagers, he also had a part-time job digging graves.
My father was a caretaker of a small cemetery, so that's how he got the job. But it was either $25 or $50, I think.
Right, it was phenomenal.
Tremendous money in the early 60s.
This inspired Stephen to write I Was a Teenage Grave Robber, a short story about an orphaned boy who digs up bodies for a mad scientist. In 1965, Comics Review accepted and published the story. He made no money, but he was finally in print. Before Stephen graduated from Lisbon High in 1966, he went on his senior class trip to New York City and Washington, D.C., during which he began what would become a 20-year habit.
And he got very drunk. And I think that the teachers saw him the next day and realized what had happened and sort of told him that shouldn't happen again, but I think he went and did it again the very next day.
He didn't understand how anybody could be a social drinker. It was always his aim to get as plastered as possible.
Although he was able to still write. That was always his constant. He was always able to write.
In 1966, the fighting in Vietnam, though not yet officially a war, was in full swing. After he graduated from high school, 19-year-old Stivene King considered joining the military. His mother, Ruth King, insisted Stephen go to college. So he cobbled together a scholarship and loans and worked in a textile mill to put himself through school. At the University of Maine, Orono, Stephen was hard to miss. A huge, badly dressed hippie.
And drugs, LSD, mushrooms, everything was like as normal as breathing back then.
He was very forceful and vocal. He spoke up in class. He had very perceptive things to say.
Stephen opposed the war in Vietnam. He expressed his views in his regular column in the campus newspaper called King's Garbage Truck. In addition to 47 columns, King also published a serialized comic western called Slade, and wrote novels and short stories.
We have many students who aspire to be writers, but what made Steve different from the beginning was that he not only aspired to be a writer, he just went ahead and did it.
As a junior in college, I remember he had 5 novels completed. So he was a very prolific writer.
During his freshman year, Stephen was professionally published. Startling Mystery Stories paid him $35 for his short story, The Glass Floor. Someone besides his mother was willing to pay for his stories. He was still desperately poor, despite the $5 a week his mother sent him.
She sent him the money even though it meant that she had to go without food. And that's how destitute she was.
In June of 1969, Stephen took a part-time job at the university library. At lunch one afternoon, he met Tabitha Spruce, a history major and aspiring poet.
He really was literally the poorest college student I've ever met in my life. And he was wearing, at that point in his life, cut-off gum rubbers because he couldn't afford shoes.
Tabitha was the third of 8 children from a working-class family from Bangor, Maine. The two shared a love of books and writing.
We fell in love. We had a kid, and then we got married, because that's the way it was done sometimes in the 60s.
Stephen graduated in 1970 with a bachelor's degree in English. Their first child, Naomi, was born months later. The family moved into a trailer in Herman, Maine, not far from Bangor. King had expected to teach English, but couldn't find a job. Instead, he pumped gas for minimum wage and worked at a commercial laundry in Bangor for $1.60 an hour. Tabitha worked nights at Dunkin' Donuts.
If I had moments when I was working at New Franklin Laundry in Bangor when I felt depressed or downhearted, it was when I thought, all I've managed to do with my college education is to replicate my mother's life.
After working all day, then playing with his child, he sat down at the typewriter at night. This, he felt, was his family's ticket out of poverty.
She gave him the room to write when it would have been very easy to say, we need money and you're wasting time sitting in this little room pecking away at this stuff. It'll never go anywhere, or if it does, we need stuff now. She could easily have been that sort of person, and she wasn't.
In the fall of 1971, Stephen got a job teaching English at Hampton Academy. He now made a respectable $6,400 a year. Yet the job became his personal nightmare. It gave him less time to write than ever. He felt his dreams slipping away. On June 4th, 1972, Stephen and Tabitha's second child, Joseph, was born. Money was so tight the Kings periodically had their phone disconnected because they couldn't pay the bill. After teaching all day, Stephen came home, graded papers, prepped his lessons, and finally retreated to the trailer's laundry room to write.
One of his friends said it was like he threw a cloak over himself and the world disappeared.
There was growing demand for his short stories, from men's magazines like Cavalier, Dude, Gent, and Swank.
I wanted to send my mother some of these stories that I'd published, but I ran them through the Xerox machine at the library at the University of Maine because they had all these ads, you know, like dial 1-800-JUGS and stuff like that on the side, and so I didn't necessarily want to see that.
Stephen made about $200 per story, but the Kings were still living hand to mouth.
For rent, for the double-wide trailer that they had, for medicine for the kids. It was always one emergency after another, as it is when you're newlyweds and you've got kids and there's more bills than there is money.
There were times when the stress of supporting a family was too much for him.
Frustration sometimes led him to the local bar or to the poker table, where he'd spend the night drinking, smoking, and gambling.
I think I was more angry at the $5 that went out every week for the carton of cigarettes than I was anything else. It was the literal burning of money that drove me nuts.
Books had always been Stephen's refuge. Now he couldn't even afford those.
We would sometimes fight about his buying a hardcover book because those two were also very expensive on that kind of a budget.
Things were bleak until a publishing contact reached out to Stephen. Bill Thompson, a veteran editor at Doubleday, had read 3 of Stephen's manuscripts and liked them. He couldn't convince Doubleday to publish them, but he didn't forget Stephen.
So I hadn't heard from him in a while, and somebody had just given me a country music calendar, and so I mailed it on to him. And I said, do you realize your birthday is the same as A.J. Carter, of the Carter family, you know, and why haven't I heard from you? I don't want to see you on the Simon & Schuster list.
Stephen had been working on a story called Carrie that he hoped to sell to Cavalier, a men's magazine.
He actually started Carrie on a dare from a friend who challenged him to write something from a woman's perspective.
The story was about the backward teenage daughter of a religious fanatic.
One of the reasons he didn't continue with it was because he could see that there was a much larger story evolving. And he was really focused on getting short stories out because he needed the money.
He put it in the trash can. He put the first part of it in the trash can, and as I was emptying the can, I picked it up and noticed it was a fairly significant block of writing, so I read it.
Stephen thought the story was a loser, but with Tabitha's assistance, he finished it and sent it to Bill.
And I thought, now this one has legs to it. This one we can really do something with. So I said, I hate to ask you to do this. Would you please do some rewrite on this, and we'll really go for it. I'll go to the wall on this one.
Stephen made the revisions, returned the manuscript, and went back to worrying about his bills. The Kings once again had their phone disconnected.
And one day when I was in the teacher's room, the loudspeaker came on and said, Mr. King, will you come to the office? You have a call from your wife. And I hurried up to the office with my heart going 100 miles an hour in my chest, because I thought to myself, one of two things has happened. Either the baby something's wrong with the baby, or I've sold the book. And she had a telegram from Bill Thompson. He had to send a telegram because he couldn't call. We had no phone. And the telegram said, Carrie officially a Doubleday book. The future lies ahead. Love, Bill Thompson. And it said, as a P.S., $2,500 okay, question mark. $2,500 was very okay. It seemed like a fortune to us.
Stephen King was 25 years old. The writing he had faithfully plugged away at for over a decade was about to take off. When Doubleday released Stephen King's Carrie in April 1974, he and his family moved out of their trailer and into an apartment in Bangor, Maine. Stephen even considered leaving his teaching job, but it seemed unlikely he'd make a living by writing alone. So he continued writing into the wee hours every night, and he continued drinking.
He was not a secretive drinker. He didn't hide his drinking from his family because to him that was normal. To his kids, he once said that it was like any father who comes home from work and has 3 or 4 martinis.
Back in New York, Doubleday was talking to New American Library, a paperback book publisher. They were also excited about the story of Carrietta White.
I think their first offer was either $200,000 or $250,000 for the paperback rights on this. Well, this just blew us all out of the water. And, you know, Bob Banker, who was our subsidiary rights man, you know, great poker player, you know. Well, actually, we were looking for more than that.
And I say to Bill, how much? And he said, 6 figures, $400,000. The phone was on the wall in the kitchen, and all the strength ran out of my legs.
Doubleday split the money from paperback sales evenly with the author. Stephen would get $200,000, enough to stop teaching and write full-time. Finally, Stephen's mother, Ruth, who had supported him with everything she had, saw her youngest son achieve success.
She was still working one of these really menial jobs, and he took her out. He says, you never have to work another day in your life, even though it was, you know, not going to last too much longer.
Known to no one but herself, Ruth King had been stoically suffering the symptoms of uterine cancer for years. She died in December 1973 at age 59, knowing that Doubleday would publish Carrie, but she never actually saw the book.
I think he was just remorse that she was never going to see him go even further. And it was a sad funeral.
Stephen was devastated, yet he realized just how much Ruth had given him with her loving support and work ethic.
Clearly she fostered the imagination because they didn't have much else.
I remember as an undergraduate he would talk about when he sold his first novel he was going to buy, I believe it was a pink Cadillac convertible, and come back to campus with his big car and sort of drive around.
King decided against the pink Cadillac. Instead, he bought a red, white, and blue one. But he was humble enough to ditch it when he returned to Durham.
And he drove this like 64 Dodge Dart, all rusted out, ugliest looking car you ever saw. And he said, you know, he just was a little embarrassed coming back home driving that great big red, white, and blue Cadillac. So he drove this $100 car.
Money hadn't changed Stephen. He was still modest and afraid that Carrie might be his one-book wonder.
This is not a dumb man, and I think he felt, I got it, but it can also go away. I'm going to enjoy it while it's here.
So he continued to write, churning out 1,500 words a day. His inspiration came from the people he met, his own life, and day-to-day incidents in rural Maine.
Ideas are everywhere, and it's what you make of them. And so there's this germ of a concept that you say, what if this happens in conjunction with this idea? So for Salem's Lot, for example, what if a vampire came to a small town where there are secrets?
Stephen wrote that story and sent the manuscript for Salem's Lot to Doubleday. They bought it and sold the paperback rights for $500,000. Again, Stephen got half. 2 novels had made him almost $500,000 richer, phenomenal for a new writer. And there was the promise of more from film adaptations. With the success of movies like Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist, horror was hot in Hollywood. Columbia Pictures soon optioned the film rights to Carrie.
He took horror out of the stuffy old mews and the old castles in foreign countries and brought it into small-town America.
But King couldn't shake the fear that success might be fleeting. He decided a change of scenery might provide new inspiration. In the fall of 1974, the Kings relocated to Boulder, Colorado. There, too, Stephen had a hard time writing. Thinking a quiet weekend together might help, he and Tabitha went to the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park.
And they were, in fact, getting ready to shut down for the winter season. They check in, and they practically have the whole hotel to themselves. King's imagination started going into overtime. He would walk down the hall, and he would see a fire hose all coiled up, and in his mind, he could visualize it and hear it thumping on the ground.
He began imagining a boy with paranormal powers who senses evil in the haunted hotel and whose alcoholic father tries to kill him. For Stephen, this was more than just another story. He knew these characters.
Although he acknowledged at the time that he drank a considerable amount, it wasn't until the time when he actually said, "I'm an alcoholic," that he said, you know, I was writing about myself, really, and my struggles with alcohol when it comes to Jack Torrance.
Anybody who's been married 3 or 4 years, who's coping with basically no funds and everything else, there's a lot of stress, interpersonal stress, and a lot of that stuff went into the novel that I wrote, The Shining, that had to do with booze, that had to do with anger, with a lot of the things that I felt at that time.
King finished The Shining in Colorado. But though the area had inspired him, Stephen missed New England. In 1975, he and his family returned to Maine. Stephen's second book, Salem's Lot, was released around Halloween. The paperback quickly followed and sold well. But late in 1976, a whole new audience discovered Stephen King with the film release of Carrie, starring Sissy Spacek. The movie was a box office hit. Stephen loved what director Brian De Palma had done, and he loved the exposure. Hollywood loved him back.
What the film Carrie did was it put King on the map in a way that a book just won't. You want to get people that aren't going to go into the bookstore. These are the non-book readers. You know, a movie like Carrie will get them into the stores.
Stephen worked up the confidence to ask Doubleday to resurrect the Stephen King books it had rejected before Carrie, especially his first novel, Rage, the story of a student who takes over a school and holds his classmates hostage. Doubleday didn't want to oversaturate the market with his name, so Stephen convinced his paperback publishers to release Rage under a pseudonym, Richard Bachman.
Rage by Richard Bachman came and sank like a stone. I mean, the world was not looking for a Richard Bachman book. And I think he was somewhat disappointed.
But the world was looking for the next Stephen King book. In 1977, Doubleday published The Shining. It quickly became both a hardcover and paperback bestseller. In fact, Stephen's first 3 novels all became bestsellers. And when he released The Stand in 1978, many considered it his masterpiece.
The Stand is, in terms of King's fiction, it's unique. Here's a man who can write characters, large and small, much like a Dickens landscape.
The Stand is one of the books that has a huge fan base. And in fact, you know, he sort of cynically says, a lot of my fans, there's a certain number of my fans who say, I could have written nothing else after The Stand and they would be perfectly happy.
The Stand is an apocalyptic tale of a superflu that wipes out most of humanity, leaving the survivors to fight a battle of good versus evil. The original manuscript was 1,200 pages long and weighed 12.5 pounds. Doubleday refused to release it unless Stephen trimmed 400 pages. He had made millions for the publisher and felt he had the right to call his own shots. But Doubleday insisted. To make matters worse, Stephen's contract doled out his payments in small yearly increments, so he wasn't seeing his share of the profits. But what sent Stephen over the edge was the way Doubleday executives treated their #1 author.
It seemed that every time that I was walking the halls with him and some of the brass would go by, they never once recognized him. I'd have to introduce him.
In 1977, Stephen negotiated a deal with New American Library, his paperback publisher. They agreed to give him a $2.5 million advance for his next 3 books: The Dead Zone, Firestarter, and what turned out to be Cujo. Viking purchased the rights to the hardcover versions. The Kings could now afford to live anywhere they wanted. In the fall of 1977, they relocated to England for a creative change of pace. Just months before, Stephen and Tabitha had welcomed a 3rd child, Owen Philip, into their family. The Kings stayed in the UK for just a year, While there, Stephen struck up a friendship with American novelist Peter Straub, then living in London. The two made plans to write a book together, what would eventually become The Talisman. In 1978, the Kings decided to return to Maine.
Because it's a place where they've been able to live a fairly normal life. They're not living the life of Los Angeles celebrities in some gated enclave. They can walk down the street, they can be ordinary people.
For a while, they rented a house in Orrington, outside Bangor, on a busy road that they discovered was treacherous. So many animals were killed by speeding transport trucks, they had their own burial ground for them, the woods behind Stephen's backyard.
One of the kids would have his wagon, put the body in the wagon, wheel it here, everything, high ceremony, wheel it here, dig little graves, bury them, make markers, then they'd sit and have a little after-burial party.
When Naomi's cat Smucky met an untimely end, it too was buried there. Then the Kings had a brush with every parent's worst nightmare.
Think about your 2-year-old son running to the side of the road with the transport coming. There was a what if. That really happened. Owen was almost killed by a transport. And as soon as he saves his life, the what if? What if I hadn't?
The near miss inspired Stephen to write Pet Sematary, the story of a father who finds a way to bring his child back with horrific consequences.
And of course in the book the 2-year-old is killed on the road, and I found that very, very hard to read and deal with.
Both he and his wife didn't think that it was something that people would want to read.
Pet Sematary went into a drawer for 3 years. Instead, Stephen began writing The Dead Zone, about a man who developed psychic abilities after coming out of a coma. As King became more popular, his fans became more demanding.
They wanted to see him, they wanted to talk to him, they wanted to see where he lived.
I once said to him that I thought The Dead Zone was an autobiographical novel. The situation in The Dead Zone where you have this person with this gift that, in a sense, makes life very difficult for him because everybody wants a kind of piece of the gift.
Do you know me? It's frightening how many novels of suspense I've written.
Advertisers in Hollywood were interested in Stephen as well. His books were optioned almost as quickly as he wrote them. In 1979, director Stanley Kubrick's film version of The Shining was released. The movie was box office magic and critically acclaimed. King found it visually stunning and scary, but thought Kubrick had ignored an important theme in the book.
Kubrick kind of dismisses the genuine subtext of the book and instead kind of creates his own story based on Jack being nuts.
King began demanding a say in who directed his movies. He distrusted Hollywood and wanted to keep his distance from the star scene.
He was not your typical American celebrity who acted like he was famous.
In 1980, the Kings bought a Victorian mansion in Bangor, Maine. Craftsmen worked 3 years to renovate the 126-year-old house. The boy who'd grown up with no indoor plumbing now had a 47-foot indoor swimming pool, and in true Stephen King style,
we have bats in the house, which we do get because it's an old house. I'm the one who's in charge of bat control. I capture the bat and put it out, and he just screams and runs away.
But there was one thing Tabitha couldn't control in their new house, Stephen's escalating addiction.
With his first snort of coke, it had him hook, line, and sinker. But he also was very aware that that was a big problem.
After publishing his first best-selling books in the 1970s, Stephen King's writing output exploded in the 1980s. Between 1980 and 1984, he published 14 novels.
It's a real gift, I think, to be able to tell these enormous stories, complex, multi-threaded, huge cast of character stories.
He also wrote poetry, plays, original screenplays, and short stories. And in the 1980s, Stephen branched out even further. Both he and his son Joe, then 9, appeared in director George Romero's Creepshow, the film adaptation of 5 of Stephen's short stories combined into one.
He likes to act. He acknowledges that he's not very good at it, but he enjoys the process.
Then in 1985, Stephen took on a more ambitious role.
Dino De Laurentiis had adapted a number of his novels, and I think they joked back and forth over the years that Steve should direct a movie.
The result was Maximum Overdrive, based on Stephen's short story, Trucks. He completed the film with a lot of support.
All sorts of people who knew that this was somebody who didn't really know all the rules of filmmaking.
The film barely registered at the box office. Stephen swore he would never direct again, and later admitted he was fueled by cocaine during production.
He was very high functioning. In fact, his output was amazing.
Meanwhile, some of King's books, like The Shining, were now being taught in college courses. But not everyone admired his work. Some literary critics dismissed it as too grisly and commercial.
He poked fun at himself. He used to make the joke that he was the literary equivalent of a Big Mac and fries.
Far worse, as far as Stephen was concerned, some school libraries had begun banning his books. The furor escalated when a series of school shootings were reportedly inspired by his novel, Rage, published under his now-revealed pseudonym, Richard Bachman.
If there's anything that I regret in my career, it's publishing the novel Rage. Several kids have killed teachers or held classes hostage who apparently had read that book.
He pulled Rage from publication, but would not apologize for the rest of his work. In fact, in 1986, he helped spearhead a campaign against book banning at a rally in Virginia Beach. Stephen also began to stretch beyond his trademark horror. One of his short stories, The Body, was released as the film Stand By Me in 1986, directed by Rob Reiner.
Look, over there! I see him! I see him!
None of us could breathe. Somewhere under those bushes was the rest of Ray Brower.
The coming-of-age tale set in Maine was based on a true story from Stephen's childhood. The four young boys were composite sketches of childhood friends from Durham, and the film evoked emotional memories for Stephen.
And when the movie was over, he said, "Look, you got to give me some time. I can't talk now." And we went outside for about 20 minutes, and he just sat inside by himself. And it took him that long to recover because it was a very painful, very painful experience for him to have to relive.
In early 1986, Stephen wrote perhaps his most terrifying work to date.
King has always written a lot of books about writers with the writer as the main character.
Misery is about an author who gives up the genre he'd been writing in to try something new. Through a twist of fate, he's captured by Annie Wilkes, his self-described #1 fan, who refuses to release him until he writes one more novel just for her.
And she had the axe and the blowtorch to make it happen.
Annie Wilkes was a real stand-in for his drug and alcohol addictions through the years. He tried to get away from it. She wouldn't let him escape.
And maybe it became a certain point where he thought this is the way it has to be, that the drinking is an integral part of the creative process.
Misery was a huge success, firmly lodging itself on bestseller lists for most of 1987. In just over a decade, Stephen King had sold over 100 million books. He was one of the most powerful men in publishing and in Hollywood. And he was a mess.
He was smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. He was drinking 3 to 4 six-packs of beer a day. He was chugging NyQuil and Listerine and snorting the coke.
He was very much in denial when his family staged an intervention. They basically presented him with the evidence.
Tabby and the kids finally had had enough.
Either you get straight or you leave because we think that you're on the road to killing yourself and we don't want to see it.
His biggest fear was that he would be unable to write if he was sober.
But given the choice between not writing again and keeping his relationship with his family, he sided with his family. He said, "This is a sacrifice I'm willing to risk. If the creativity goes with sobriety, then I'm willing to do that."
It would be years before King was 100% sober, but with considerable support, he was able to get his life back on track.
Later, after he got sober, Tabby, his wife, said, "You would have a hangover every single morning for years and years and years, and then you would start drinking in the afternoon.
But ultimately, he became very open and doesn't shy away from talking about that period in his life.
And Stephen returned to writing, sober. In 1990, the film version of Misery premiered. The thriller was a hit, and actress Kathy Bates won an Oscar for her performance.
I'm sorry, Paul, this is all wrong.
What?
You'll have to do it over again. It's not worthy of you. Throw it all out, except for that part of naming the gravedigger after me. You can leave that in.
Over the years, Maine had been good to the Kings, and now they returned the favor. In Bangor, there was no field suitable for Little League baseball.
He came up with the idea of the Little League field here in Bangor. It was all out of his pocket.
People being the way they are, they instantly called it the Field of Screams.
Nor did Stephen forget the importance of the public library in his formation as a writer. With his wife Tabitha as chairperson, they spearheaded fundraising to expand the local Bangor library.
He also started a couple of new foundations specifically to help artists and writers and performers who have become disabled.
He even bought Bangor's local AM rock station to ensure that it stayed independent. It was renamed WZON, and eventually Stephen bought 2 more local FM stations.
Stephen King.
And in time, he and other prominent writers formed a band called the Rock Bottom Remainders. They tour to raise money for literacy and other causes.
Stephen's biggest fear is that suddenly the entire band will stop and turn to him and go, "Take it!"
And it's allowed them to rub elbows with Bruce Springsteen, Warren Zevon, and he's gotten to know John Mellencamp.
But even though many of Stephen's personal demons had been conquered, he continued dreaming up new ones for the page. Between 1985 and 1999, he published 26 more books. In 1996 alone, he published 2 books, plus 6 volumes of his serial novel, The Green Mile.
All 6 installments were on the bestseller list at the same time. I think some of the other authors were saying, you know, make a little bit room for us.
Smile, you're on America's Most Wanted.
Given how prolific and popular he was, overzealous fans were becoming more frequent. Despite security, a man broke into the King's Bangor home early one morning in April 1991, while Tabitha was alone.
He came in the window and he said, "I have a bomb and I'm going to kill you." And I said, "Oh," and went out the nearest door in my pajamas.
Celebrity stalkers were the downside of his success, but the upside was considerable. His stories were hot properties for TV and movie adaptations, especially his non-horror short stories like Dolores Claiborne and The Shawshank Redemption.
There's been a significant shift. People saw him as a popular and moneyed writer, and now I think many people are seeing him as an important writer.
One of the few things Stephen didn't have was an answer to what had happened to his father, Donald King, who walked out on his family without a trace nearly 50 years earlier. In the late 1990s,
a documentary producer tracked him down because David gave him his Social Security number.
The producer found that Stephen and David's father had been living in Wind Gap, Pennsylvania until November of 1980 when he died. And Donald had other secrets.
Donald had gone off and married and created another family in Pennsylvania. He was a bigamist because he was never divorced from Ruth.
Stephen was given the name of his father's second family and discovered they were Brazilian, but Stephen decided not to contact them.
He didn't want to disrupt another family because he knew what that was like.
The life Stephen King now had was beyond his wildest dreams. By 1999, more than 300 million copies of his books were in worldwide circulation. His children had grown up and left home, and he and Tabitha were looking forward to a new phase in their lives. They discussed buying a home in Florida. But that June, Stephen stepped into his own horror story.
Stephen King was doing what he does every afternoon, taking his afternoon walk with his nose in a book, just like he did when he was 13.
He saw this van coming towards him, and it was not just on the road, it was off the road, on the shoulder, and he only had enough time to sort of half turn away, which probably saved his life.
He was severely injured, I think probably more seriously than the press was aware of.
Steve almost lost his life. In fact, one of the EMTs that was at the scene told him later that he was surprised that Steve did, in fact, survive the accident.
Stephen sustained injuries to his lungs. He broke his leg, ribs, and fractured his hip. For weeks, he was hospitalized, undergoing numerous operations. He lost over 100 pounds as a result.
So it was a long, slow, and painful recovery. And for somebody with his addiction history, having to deal with heavy pain medication was a problem.
So he was fully aware that he was back on drugs.
6 months later, Stephen made his first public appearance post-accident at the film premiere of his bestseller, The Green Mile. Brian Smith, the driver who hit Stephen, was convicted of driving to endanger, yet served no time. But that wasn't the real shocker.
On Stephen King's birthday in the year 2000, Brian Smith was found dead of an overdose.
You couldn't have written something with that level of coincidence in it.
After the accident, Steve and Tabitha decided it was time to escape Maine's punishing winters. They rented, then eventually bought a home near Sarasota, Florida. Stephen said his biggest fear after the accident was not being able to write again. But in late 1999, he slowly returned to his craft.
The next novel that he wrote, Dreamcatcher, was written completely in longhand because he couldn't sit at a computer for long periods of time.
As he convalesced, he completed his most autobiographical work, On Writing.
By talking about his life and his evolution as a writer, he lays the groundwork to say, this is why I have any credentials at all to give recommendations or advice about writing. And so, easily the first half of the book talks about his entire life.
You want to know what I'm really afraid of in terms of my work is that I won't know when it's time to stop.
Stopping doesn't seem to be in the cards for Stephen. He remains as prolific as ever, becoming the first major author to release a book exclusively over the internet with Riding the Bullet in 2000. And 3 years later, he was awarded the prestigious National Book Foundation Medal for Distinguished Contribution to American Letters.
He said he wouldn't have missed that night for anything. And in fact, he was very ill that evening.
And after the award, he went right to the hospital because it turned out that one of his lungs deflated.
He could have died from that injury. So he has said, it almost killed him to accept that award. That's what he's talking about.
For years afterward, Stephen's near-death experiences inspired his work.
He did a TV miniseries called Kingdom Hospital, and one of the first episodes of that was a very graphic recreation of the accident itself.
And in the 7th book in King's Dark Tower series, Stephen's accident actually threatened the fate of multiple universes. Perhaps the most touching of Stephen's works to grow out of his brush with death is his 2006 novel, Lisey's Story.
It's about a writer who dies and then his wife is left to deal with his legacy.
The characters aren't he and Tabby, but there are some similarities.
Since his accident, he's published more than 20 new books. And filmmakers continue to lift King's words off the page and onto the screen, like in the 2004 movie Secret Window, starring Johnny Depp.
Every turn of the page, I was just, dumbfounded at how this writer was taking me on this journey.
And in the 2007 horror thriller, The Mist.
That envelops a town in New England and weird bad things happen.
Plus, the 2007 supernatural mystery, 1408, starring John Cusack.
This film is about a very evil hotel room.
Stephen King's creative journey has led him to explore new territory. In 2008, he published Duma Key, his first suspense novel based in Florida. It rocketed to #1 on the bestseller list. But it was his next book, 2009's Under the Dome, that delivered readers an ecological suspense story.
With Under the Dome, the idea is that there's this small town in Maine where suddenly the complete town is surrounded by this invisible dome that people, they can't get in and they can't get out.
Led by a malicious local politician bearing an uncanny resemblance to former U.S. Vice President Dick Cheney, the situation turns deadly. Stephen followed this major work with a slimmer novella, Blockade Billy, published in 2010. It immediately jumped onto the bestseller list as well.
Blockade Billy is about an exceptionally good baseball player. He was a catcher. He gets the name Blockade Billy because he can block home plate. Nobody can get past him. But his complete history as a baseball player has been expunged from the records because a dark secret from his past came to light.
The work he's done is astonishing, not only in terms of the volume of work, but the kinds of material and the kinds of characters he's created. I think he's one of the great storytellers ever.
He starts with that what if, and he then is off and running to tell himself the story, because he's learning the story as he goes along.
The story of Stephen King's life is one he's still writing his way through, along with the other writers in his family. Wife Tabitha, oldest son Joe Hill, and youngest son Owen. Each has achieved their own fame in publishing. And as books and publishing are finding new ways to reach readers, so has Stephen, experimenting with graphic novel adaptations of his stories, ebooks and web-only publishing, and a Broadway musical.
The versatility of the man is extraordinary.
He has ideas queued up. They're like the airplanes coming in at the airport. They're waiting in line.
He's not going to stop experimenting until the day he dies.